Today, I am planning to speak about the power of the Guru, a topic that I find endlessly fascinating. I covered a few aspects of this in my previous talk when I spoke about the power of the Guru's silent teaching, and I may well comment on other aspects of the Guru's power in a future talk. I'm going to begin today by retelling a story that was narrated by T.K. Sundaresha Iyer, a devotee who moved closely with Bhagavan for many years. Here he is on the right of a group photo, which was taken in Palakottu in the late 1930s. At the top of the slide are two more photos of him, both taken during the same era. The story comes from Sundaresha Iyer's memoir, At the Feet of Bhagavan. The cover of the current edition of the book is featured on the right of the slide. Above it, in the center, is Sundaresha Iyer standing next to Bhagavan. Before I start, I want to tell a short story of how this book came to be published, since I had a minor role in it. Around 1980, when I was cataloguing the Ramana Swamy archives, Bhagavan's grandnephew, Ganesan, who was running the ashram at that time along with his father, called me into the ashram office and gave me the key to one of the cupboards that featured prominently there. This is Ganesan standing in Ramanaswaram around that time. It seems we were attending a book release function, and both our hands are on a plate that contained the book. It was a Telugu text that had been written or published by the young man on my left. He sent me a copy of this photo a few months ago after we'd had a chance meeting on Arunachala. Prior to that, I had completely forgotten that this photo existed. Going back to the story, Ganesan said, "David, this is where we store our old manuscripts and notebooks connected with Bhagavan. I'm like a dog in the manger with this cupboard. If I bark if anyone goes near it, but I have no idea what I'm guarding. Why don't you go through it and catalogue what's there?" I jumped at the opportunity. Going through it, I soon discovered that it contained an Aladdin's treasure house of archival material connected to Bhagavan. There were manuscripts in Bhagavan's handwriting, notebooks he had scribbled in, manuscripts, proof copies of ashram books, and so on. Right at the back, stuffed behind one of the shelves, was the manuscript that was later published as At the Feet of Bhagavan. This is Sundaresha's Iyer that I featured on the previous slide. It had clearly been prepared for publication by someone at Ramanaswaram, since there were marks addressed to a printer on many of the pages. However, instead of being sent off for publication, it had been stuffed at the back of this cupboard and forgotten about. About 15 years later, in the 1990s, when I was sitting in the back of a car with Ganesan, I asked him why this manuscript had not been published in the 1960s, when all the preparatory work had been done in it. Ganesan laughed and said, "I wanted to publish, but the ashram was very short of money in those days. Kopikar, who worked in the office, said we didn't have any spare money for the printing. I was going to overrule him and send it to the printer anywhere, but Kopikar found out what I was planning to do. He took the only manuscript copy we had and hid it. Until you went through that cupboard and found it stuffed at the back, I had no idea what he had done with it." This is a revealing little window into how poor Ramanaswaram was in the 1960s when the manuscript was hidden. It is only a small book, about 100 pages long, but printing it then was considered to be a project too far for the ashram's meager budget. Before I continue, here is a lovely old group photo taken in 1961 that features the people I've been talking about so far. At the back, circled in red, is Ganesan. On the left, inside the red circle, is Sundaresha Iyer, and on the right, inside the remaining circle, is Kopikar. The photo was taken at a Graha Pravesham, a house consecration ceremony. The site of this house was behind where Sheshadri Swami's ashram is located. In those days, it was all empty land. And now on to Sundaresha Iyer's story, which comes from a section entitled Walk with Bhagavan to the Lake. I'm going to read out the whole thing since it is full of interesting comments by Bhagavan on the nature and application of the Guru's power. This is how it begins. The Samudram lake at the foot of our natural hill near Sri Ramanaswaram is very extensive. Neither summer rains nor winter monsoons in Tiruvannamalai fill this lake save once in a way when it overflows. This is a photo of the lake with our natural in the background taken when it was more or less full. The raised bank on the right is a man-made structure designed to keep the water in. When full, it's about 15 feet deep next to the bund. Sundarasha Iyer continues with his story. Thus, it overflowed once long years ago in 1931. The site of it was very grand and the outflow was as wide as a river. The tank really seemed that day like the ocean of its name, Samudram. Bhagavan told us that it held this name because a certain local ruler had this tank constructed as a miniature sea to give his queen an idea of what a sea would look like, for she had never seen the sea and wished to do so. This photo is the overflow taken a few years ago. I am the man in the dark blue shirt helping a lady to paddle across. My house is quite close to this overflow. Sundaresha Iyer continued. Bhagavan talked of many things on that walk with us, but at this distance of time, I remember only two topics that interested me. At one place, he pointed out a palmyra tree which had decayed in the embrace of a parasitic banyan tree. Some bird had dropped a banyan seed into the palmyra, and as it began to grow, the palmyra became cloven and stunted in its own growth. This is the banyan tree that Bhagavan pointed out. Amazingly, it is still standing almost 100 years later. And this is a close-up of the inside of the same banyan tree with the straight trunk of the palmyra visible in the middle. Palmyras are palm-like trees with a long, straight trunk and fronds at the top. Bhagavan then compared the way that the banyan tree had enclosed and consumed the pre-existing palmyra tree to the way that the Guru consumed a devotee's vast tree of past tendencies with a single look. The account continues. Drawing our attention to this phenomenon, Bhagavan remarked that this is just what the look of grace from a jnani does. One look into a soul and the whole tree of past tendencies and prejudices, vasanas, gathered up through long cycles of past births, is burned up and decays away. Then the reality of the self is experienced. Bhagavan is confirming in this extract that a single look from a jnani can end the seemingly unending sequence of births and deaths. And in this next slide, Bhagavan, continuing his explanation, added that the same effect could be produced by the jnani's touch. This is something I will be speaking out in more detail later. Sundaresha Iyer continued. Thus he explained to us the effect of contact with the great, and he said that the supreme jnana obtained with the touch of the saint can never be won through the study of any number of scriptures or by any store of good deeds, or by any other spiritual practices and efforts. Later, on return to the ashram, I put this in verse form. Here is another photo of the inside of this remarkable tree, and on the top of the slide is a photo of Sundaresha Iyer standing next to Ganeshan, probably around 1960. This is the verse that Sundaresha composed when he returned to the ashram. A bird drops seed upon a tree and causes its decay. So Guru's grace raised knowledge into the seeking mind, replacing ego shadows with resplendent jnana's light. There is a footnote at this point in the text, which I assume was written by Sundaresha Iyer himself, and this is what it says. The seed of the huge banyan tree, which grows to shelter hundreds, is one of the tiniest and represents unselfish benevolence. The seed of the palmyra, which is so large, grows into a tree which can hardly shelter a single man from the sun, and so well represents the selfish ego. Yet this tiny seed can be dropped by a bird in its droppings, and while it grows, it can demolish the palmyra tree itself. So the tiny seed of grace can destroy the great tree of egoism. This is an expansion on what Bhagavan was alluding to earlier, that the tiny seed of the banyan representing the Guru's power and look has the power to consume and destroy fully grown trees, which in this analogy are the devotees' egos. Sundaresha Iyer continued, then when we actually came to the overflowing outlet at the end of the lake, we all marveled at its width. We stayed there for some time and then returned. Here's a chance for viewers of this talk to marvel as well. This is the most recent time Samudram overflowed at the end of last year. Over 60 centimeters of rain were recorded in a gauge near Ramana Swamy over a period of only 36 hours. There were major floods locally, and at least 10 people died in Tiruvannamalai from drowning, mudslides, or collapsed houses. This clip, in which I'm standing next to my friend Bob, gives some indication of how major the flood was. The flow was even stronger on the previous evening when I visited with my wife Miri. You could hear her voice in the background of this clip. On the way back, Bhagavan and his party paused at the sluice gate that controlled the outflow to the fields on the downside of the dam. The sluice gate is no longer in operation, although it still worked when I first went there in the 1970s. The photo on the right shows the place where the sluice used to be. It was in the center of this earthen masonry construction, but in recent years, the sluice and its retaining wall have been slowly crumbling and subsiding into the lake. Sundaresha Iyer continued. On the return walk, we happened to pass the sluice at the center of the bund. Pointing to this, Bhagavan remarked, look at this small outlet as compared with the big one at the end. But for this small hole through which the stream of water trickles, the vast contents of the lake would not be helpful to vegetation. And Bhagavan continued, if the bund breaks, it will be a regular deluge and the entire crop will be destroyed. Only if the water be served under proper regulation through the sluice are the plants helped to grow. So too is it with divine consciousness. And in the photo, that looks like me again in the pale blue shirt, paddling across the overflow. Bhagavan is establishing his analogy here. The grace and power of the Guru needs to be channeled and released in controlled amounts, the right amount that is needed for the devotee to grow and flourish. If too much is released, the mind of the devotee can be damaged in just the same way that an uncontrolled flood of water damages the landscape. Bhagavan continued, unless the bliss of this consciousness is gifted through the grace of the Guru in controlled outlets, the soul cannot be helped to the destruction of its tendencies of the past, for in this way the self, abiding as such in its oneness with the divine, is established in the Guru's state of being. In the next part of the account, Bhagavan asserts that holding on to being consciousness begins to destroy the vasanas that cause the mind to extrovert and move towards objects of perception and thought. Bhagavan then notes that this only happens in the proximity of the Guru. The channeled power of the Guru induces an awareness of being consciousness in those who are near him, and that abidance slowly eliminates the vasanas. This is how he expressed it. Holding on to its being consciousness, the work of destroying the past vasanas proceeds as and when thoughts arise to push the mind into action. This work becomes possible only in the proximity of the Guru. Hence, the Guru is himself like the sluice and irrigates souls with grace from his ocean of kindness, needed so that the self may abide and the old tendencies be withered away. Since Bhagavan, in his conclusion, which I'm about to read, speaks about a deluge that sweeps everything before it, here is another clip of the uncontrolled overflow that destroyed our local road and came close to destroying a brand new bridge about a kilometer downstream. This is how Bhagavan finished his analogy of the floodwater and the Guru's power. He said, finish this first. Bhagavan said, but if the bund is broken, the full force of the whole lake rushes through and sweeps everything before it. This resembles a practitioner, a sadhaka, receiving the full force of divine consciousness without the intervening and mitigating grace of Guru's sluice. He dies without the benefit of having the tendencies destroyed. There are many implications in the statement on the screen, some of which I will address in the next few slides. It seems that the Guru is sitting on and controlling a vast reservoir of power. Released in a controlled and appropriate way, it enables devotees to dwell in a vasana eliminating state of being consciousness. But if too much power is released, mental and physical damage can result. Too much power, according to Bhagavan, can even be fatal. The idea that the Guru can transmit a physically damaging amount of power and therefore has to control its flow is one that I've heard from several jnanis I've spent time with. One of them is Lakshmana Swamy, seen here on the right. He used to transmit in the ways that Bhagavan did, through silence and through the eyes. When I sat with him, I found these transmissions induced very strong states of bliss, peace, and utter mental silence. But Lakshmana Swamy said privately that not everyone could process the transmission in a beneficial and purifying way. He said that in some cases it, quote, overheated devotees' brains, unquote. I think that after this discovery, he toned it down a bit and even began to see people less and less. The other person I want to mention is Papaji, seen here on the left of the photo, in a photo that was taken in the early 1950s. He told me once that the unregulated flow of the Guru's power could be both damaging and even fatal. Look at those cows outside the gate, he said to me once. If I try to transmit power to one of those cows, it will not get enlightened. It will probably go mad and then die. In both of these cases, the teachers had learned that there is a limit to how much power from a jnani can be processed in a beneficial way. All of these stories, Bhagavan's explanations on his walk to the lake, and my reports of what Lakshmana Swamy and Papaji said on this subject seem to indicate that teachers who have the power to transmit are acutely aware of how too much power can be damaging, and that they control their transmission to make sure that it is always beneficial. When I narrated the story of the walk to the lake, I included the following remark made by Bhagavan that was recorded by Sundaresha Iyer. He, Bhagavan, said the supreme jnana obtained with the touch of the saint, my emphasis here, can never be won through the study of any number of scriptures or by any store of good deeds or by any other spiritual practices and efforts. Sundaresha Iyer is standing on the left of this group photo, which was taken on the slopes of Arunachala around 1940. The boy standing next to him is Sundaram, the former president of Ramanasramam. Bhagavan didn't often speak about liberation through the touch of the jnani, even though he successfully used this method himself. In the next few slides, I will be going through the known occasions when he tried this, because the stories taken as a whole demonstrate that the jnani can experiment and regulate the amount of power that is needed for a successful transmission. In 1915, Bhagavan's attendant, Palaniswami, who had served Bhagavan since the 1890s, was dying in Virupaksha cave. When Bhagavan had moved up the hill to Skandashram the year before, Palaniswami stayed behind because he wasn't strong enough to do the additional climb to Skandashram. On the right is the only known photo of Palaniswami taken around 1914, somewhere in the vicinity of Virupaksha cave. Bhagavan is sitting behind him. Bhagavan's mother is to his left, and Sivaprakasam Pillai, the devotee who compiled Who Am I, Nanya, is sitting in front of them. I've put up an additional group photo taken in front of Virupaksha cave on the top left, but Palaniswami doesn't feature in it. It does, though, give a clearer picture of how Bhagavan looked in those days, since the picture on the right is very murky and low res. As Palaniswami was dying, Bhagavan put one hand on his head and the other on Palaniswami's heart center and kept them there until he thought that the individual self had been extinguished. At that point, Bhagavan took away his hands. A few seconds later, the I thought reappeared, left the body through the eyes, and according to Sri Ramana, took rebirth in one of the Deva realms. This was, so far as we know, Bhagavan's first attempt to liberate a devotee in his dying moments by putting his hands on a devotee's heart center and transmitting power which pushed the I thought back into the heart. This process should eradicate the vasanas, thus ensuring that rebirth cannot happen again. Fast forward a few years to 1922, which was the next time that Bhagavan tried out this method, this time on his own mother. On the right, we have a group photo in the Skandashram era in which Bhagavan's mother, Aragama, is sitting in front of her son. The top left picture is a cropped and slightly enlarged photo taken from the same source. The resolution on this is a little murky since it is a photo of a print. The original has long since disappeared. In her final hours, when Bhagavan could see that his mother was nearing death, he tried the same technique he had used on Palaniswami several years before. This time, though, he kept his hands in place for a much longer period. Afterwards, he remarked, "I thought that she was liberated, but remembering what had happened in Palaniswami's case, I kept my hands there for a few minutes longer." In her final moments, Bhagavan said that he was seeing scenes from all her potential future lives appear, like the fast forwarding of a film. When the film ended, he kept his hands in place to ensure that liberation was complete and that the I thought would not escape as it had done with Palaniswami. There was an audible ringing noise that Bhagavan heard as the process was being completed with both Palaniswami and his mother. When it happened with Palaniswami, he thought that it indicated that his eye had died and he removed his hands. When he heard the same noise as his mother was passing away, he recognized it and kept his hands in place a little longer. When Aragama was passing, several of the devotees present also heard the ringing noise and commented on it. This is how Munagala Venkataramaya described it, summarizing a dialogue he had just heard in the hall. Munagala was the interpreter in the hall in the 1930s and was responsible for recording most of the dialogues that later appeared in talks with Sri Ramana Maharshi. That's Munagala on the right, standing outside his Palakatu hut in the late 1930s, and next to it is a photo of him taken during the same era. This is what he recorded in September 1936. He, Bhagavan, was all along holding her, the mother's head, with one hand, the other hand placed on her bosom. What does it signify? He himself said later that there was a struggle between himself and his mother until her spirit reached the heart. Munagala continues, evidently the soul passes through a series of subtle experiences and Sri Bhagavan's touch generates a current which turns the soul back from its wandering into the heart. Munagala continues, the samskaras, however, persist, and a struggle is kept up between the spiritual force set up by his touch and the innate samskaras until the latter are entirely destroyed and the soul is led into the heart to rest in eternal peace, which is the same as liberation. Munagala continues, its entry into the heart is signified by a peculiar sensation perceptible to the Mahatma, similar to the tinkling of a bell. When Maharshi attended on Palaniswami on his deathbed, he took away his hand after the above signal, but Palaniswami's eyes opened immediately, signifying that the spirit had escaped through them, thereby indicating a higher rebirth but not liberation. For the final part of Munagala's explanation, I've added a different photo. This is a group photo taken in the late 1930s, the era when Munagala was recording Bhagavan's words. Munagala is circled in red, sitting at Bhagavan's feet. He concluded, having once noticed it with Palaniswami, Maharshi continued touching his mother for a few minutes longer. even after the signal of the soul passing into the heart, and thus ensured her liberation. When I told the story of Bhagavan's walk to the lake, he made it quite clear in his comments that too much power from a guru could kill a body without destroying the vasanas that would bring about a rebirth. In the two cases I've just summarized, Ramana Swamy and Saradamma, it's possible to conclude that too little power or power not applied for long enough can also fail to destroy the vasanas that bring about rebirth. It seems that some experimentation may be required to get exactly the right balance, and that Saradamma was the ultimate beneficiary of a previously unsuccessful experiment in transmission. I'm going to return to this topic later. Before I continue with that theme, I want to add some more examples of Bhagavan touching the heart center of devotees in the dying moments. I'm going to give all the details I have of the next two cases, since I think that these incidents are not as well known as the two more famous ones I've just discussed. I think the next occasion Bhagavan used this method was probably Valli the deer, who lived in the ashram and passed away there in the 1930s. I'm going to read out in full Ramana Swamy's account of Valli's life and her passing away in the ashram. There are no photos of Valli that I know of, so I will put up a photo of her samadhi, which was built by Ramana Swamy, with Bhagavan standing next to him, supervising. The little shrine is next to the stairs at the back of Ramanashram. The samadhi shrine in the center of this line, that of an anonymous crow, had not been constructed when the top photo was taken. It does, though, appear in the center of the photo at the bottom, which also has the names of the deceased animals who are buried there. This is how Ramana Swamy's narrative begins. Some devotees once brought a baby deer and left it at the ashram. Initially, Bhagavan was reluctant to accept it. Why do we want a deer in the ashram? Who will look after it? He asked. Ramana Swamy continues. It was only when Madhava Swamy, Bhagavan's attendant, volunteered to look after her that he allowed her to stay. The deer, which was called Valli, grew up as an ashram pet. Bhagavan regularly fed her with rice, dal, and cashew nuts, a mixture which she greatly liked. Some devotees also occasionally fed her with puffed rice and dal. Valli had no interest in the puffed rice. She would pick out the dal piece by piece and leave the rest. This is a photo taken outside Bhagavan's bathroom in the 1930s. And Ramana Swamy is on the right, Bhagavan is in the center, and Madhava Swamy is standing behind Bhagavan's shoulder. I should mention that it was a rule at Ramanashram that if animals were donated, they would not be accepted unless a specific devotee volunteered to look after the animal and make sure it was properly cared for. So Madhava Swamy, accepting responsibility for Valli, ensured that she was allowed to stay in the ashram. The story continues. Valli often came to the hall and put her forehead on the soles of Bhagavan's feet. Sometimes when she did this, Bhagavan would play with her by pushing his feet strongly against her head. Valli would respond by playfully butting Bhagavan's feet. At other times, when Valli danced on her hind legs, Bhagavan would stand alongside her, imitating her actions by dancing with his feet and waving his arms. This is, of course, Bhagavan sitting in the old hall. It would have been wonderful to have a photo of Bhagavan and Valli dancing or interacting together there, but as I mentioned earlier, there are no photos of her that I know of. Ramana Swamy continues with his story. The photo here is of Isanya Mat, which, as its name suggests, is located on the northeast side of Arunachala. It's about 4 kilometers away from Ramanashram. The photo was taken around 1980. One day, Valli went off to graze with some goats. When they reached Isanya Mat, about 2 miles away, someone attacked Valli and damaged one of her legs so badly she was unable to return to the ashram. She lay there unattended for over a day. Ramana Swamy continues. When Valli failed to return to the ashram that night, Bhagavan sent me and Rangaswamy out to look for her. Someone gave us false information that the deer had been seen on one of the Muslim streets in town. We went there feeling that she might have ended up in a cooking pot, but no one there could recollect seeing her. I have circled Rangaswamy in red in this group photo. Annamalai Swami is sitting next to him with a Rudraksha mala around his neck and a lot of vibhuti smeared on his forehead. When I interviewed him in the 1980s, he told me that he was easy to spot on ashram group photos because he usually had his arms folded and had a Rudraksha mala around his neck. TK Sundaresha I, whose account began this presentation, is standing behind Annamalai Swami and Rangaswamy. He is dressed in white with folded arms. Annamalai Swami's narrative continues. Valli was discovered the next day by a group of devotees who were walking near Isanya Mat. They bandaged her leg and brought her back to the ashram. A local vet, who was also a devotee, examined her and decided that her leg had been broken. He bandaged it and gave us a few instructions on how to look after her. This is Annamalai Swami standing on the left. As I mentioned in the last slide, he is easy to spot because his arms are folded, he is wearing a Rudraksha around his neck, and he has a liberal daubing of vibhuti on his forehead. Annamalai Swami now gets to the part of the story where Bhagavan put his hand on Valli's heart center as she was about to die. The building at the top of the slide is the old dining room, the place where this incident took place. And below it is a photo of Bhagavan sitting in the old dining room in the 1930s, being fanned by Mudaliapati. The old dining room was located where the Samadhi hall is currently today. You can see the apex roof of the old hall peeping out behind it. We put her in a corner of the old dining room, but she never recovered from her injury. About a month later, Bhagavan, sensing that she was about to die, went to the basket in which she was lying. It was very early, about 4 a.m. He sat next to her, putting one hand on her head and one hand on her heart center. Annamalai Swami continues. Bhagavan occasionally did this to devotees who were dying. His aim was to make the mind go back into the heart and die there. When this technique was successfully applied, the fortunate devotee attained self-realization. He had first tried to do this with Palana Swami, one of his early attendants, but it was not a success. In later years, he successfully brought about the self-realization of both his mother and Lakshmi the cow by touching them in this way while they were dying. The photo here shows Annamalai Swami and Lakshmi together. In the 1930s, devotees used to take it in turns to put a rope around Lakshmi's neck and take her out to graze when there was no fodder available inside the ashram. Here is Annamalai Swami's description of Bhagavan's hands-on intervention in Valli's final moments. Bhagavan kept his hands in this position for about an hour. Once during this period, Valli urinated on him, but he paid no attention. He remained at her side, touching her head and heart center, until she finally passed away at about 5 a.m. I don't think that Bhagavan brought about her self-realization because he never talked about the incident. If he had been successful, I'm sure he would have told us about it. I would concur with this. I think Bhagavan would have made some declaration had Valli been liberated in this exchange. However, he did seem to regard her as a special devotee, as the remainder of Annamalai Swami's story indicates. The photo here shows Bhagavan returning from the hill. The Samadhi shrine that he had built for Valli is at the bottom of the steps on the right side of the photo. Annamalai Swami continues, later that morning, Bhagavan asked me to construct a small Samadhi shrine near the back gate of the ashram. We should build a Samadhi for Valli in the ashram itself, he said. We don't need any masons, the two of us can build it together. In this photo, Bhagavan, followed by Madhava Swami, has walked past Valli's Samadhi after returning from the hill. You can see half of Valli's Samadhi on the extreme left of the picture. Annamalai Swami continues with his narration. I did the masonry work. Bhagavan just assisted me by handing me the bricks. When the main structure of the Samadhi was completed, Bhagavan asked me to install a lingam and do puja to it. I accomplished both tasks with Bhagavan standing at my side. All this took several hours. While the Samadhi was being built and the funeral ceremonies were being performed, Bhagavan did not go to the hall. The devotees who came for darshan all had to come to where we were working. The main photo here is a murky and very damaged image of Bhagavan returning to Ramanaswaram from a walk on Arunachala. I have included it here because it shows Valli's Samadhi very clearly. Yogi Ramaya is standing next to Bhagavan on the steps, while Madhava Swami is the attendant standing slightly behind them. Bhagavan occasionally made special arrangements for the burial of devotees if he thought their spiritual attainments merited it. When I spoke about Mastan a couple of months ago, I mentioned that Bhagavan sent Kunti Swami to Desor after he passed away to construct an elaborate samadhi that is prescribed when Saiva saints die. And when Mudaliapati died, he intervened and requested that she be buried as a sannyasin in her own compound instead of being cremated. There are two photos of Mudaliapati here on the slide. In the one at the bottom, she is standing outside the Ramanaswaram office with her daughter-in-law, Kemakshi Amal. I want to move on now to another devotee who had the immense good fortune of being touched by Bhagavan on the heart center as he was passing away. His name is Sathya Narayana Rao, and he is shown here on the right. He came from a large Andhra family of Bhagavan's devotees, one of whom served in the ashram office and even occasionally managed the ashram when Chinnaswamy was absent. In 1939, Sathya Narayana Rao was dying in one of the Ramanaswaram rooms. Devotees who visited him reported that he appeared to be in a lot of pain. News of this was brought to the old hall, but Bhagavan initially seemed to be uninterested in the matter. "What can I do?" he asked. "Am I a doctor?" The photo at the top is of Bhagavan sitting on his sofa in the old hall. However, after a few minutes, he got up and went with Krishna Swami to the room where the man was dying. Sathya Narayana Rao was lying on a bed in a small room which was next to the storeroom. Bhagavan sat next to him and put one hand on his head and the other on the heart center. Sathya Narayana Rao had previously been twisting and turning in bed in an attempt to alleviate his pain, but a few seconds after Bhagavan touched him, he quietened down, closed his eyes, and lay still on the bed. After about half an hour, Bhagavan said, we have finished here, we can go and eat. Bhagavan had delayed going for lunch because he wanted to finish his work with Sathya Narayana Rao. While Bhagavan was eating, a devotee came to inform him that Sathya Narayana Rao had died. However, before he died, he had opened his eyes, smiled, and reached out to touch his two sisters who were sitting next to his bed. When Bhagavan heard this, he exclaimed, "Aha, the thief came back again. I thought that his mind had completely subsided. His vasanas, mental habits and tendencies came up again. His attachment to his sisters made him reach out and touch them." In the case of Palaniswamy, Bhagavan said that the eye thought escaped through the eyes at the moment of death and took another birth. One can assume that something similar happened in this case as well. This story was told to me by Krishna Swamy, who was an eyewitness to all these events. That's Krishna Swamy on the right, standing with Bhagavan in Palakottu in the 1930s. Krishna Swamy was the chief attendant in the old hall for many years. Since this important story had not been recorded in any Ramanaswaram books, I did a little research and discovered that many of the circumstantial details were corroborated in a manuscript that had been written by Narasimha Rao, Sathya Narayana Rao's brother. Gridalur Narasimha Rao was the brother I mentioned earlier, who occasionally helped Chinnaswamy in ashram management business. Narasimha Rao, the brother of the dead man, features in this group photo standing directly behind Bhagavan and wearing a white shirt. A few other people I've mentioned today are also in this photo. TK Sundaresha Iyer is sitting on the front row, second from the right. Chinnaswamy, also seated on the front row, is between Sundaresha Iyer and Bhagavan. There is a row of people standing behind Bhagavan. On the left, circled in red, is Annamalai Swami. Behind Bhagavan, encircled, is Narasimha Rao, the deceased man's brother, and then two people along on the right is Kunji Swami. I want to move on now to the final story of Bhagavan touching devotees on the heart center as they were passing away. It's the case of Lakshmi the cow. Her case is a little bit different in ways that I will explain as I tell her story. The photo is of Lakshmi with one of her many calves. Bhagavan is squatting next to the calf. I'm not going to tell the story of Lakshmi in full since I've done that elsewhere. There is a whole chapter about her in The Power of the Presence, Part 3, and I also made a video about her in 2014. I will give the links to those presentations in the write-up to this video. I want to focus instead on her final moments when Bhagavan visited her and put his hand on her heart center. But before I do that, I want to mention a couple of important incidents that indicate what a mature devotee she was. The first story was narrated by Shantamal, the woman in white who is standing behind Bhagavan. She was the head of a group of Brahmin widows who did most of the cooking at Ramana Ashram for many years. This is what she reported. She, Lakshmi, would come daily to the ashram, have her meals, graze on the ashram land, enter the hall, and sit contentedly near Bhagavan. In the evening, she would go back to the town with the other women. Once, when Lakshmi was pregnant for the third time, she came into the hall after lunch. Bhagavan was reading a newspaper at the time. Lakshmi came near him and started licking the papers. Shantamal is the woman in the center of this group. She continues with her story. Bhagavan looked up and said, "Wait a little, Lakshmi," but Lakshmi went on licking. Bhagavan laid his paper aside, put his hands behind Lakshmi's horns, and rested his head against hers. They stayed like this for quite a long time. I stood nearby looking at the wonderful scene. After about 10 minutes, Bhagavan turned to me and said, "Do you know what Lakshmi is doing? She's in samadhi." Shantamal is standing in the rear of this photo, dressed in her usual white sari. She concluded, "I looked at her and noticed that tears were flowing in streams down her broad cheeks. Her breathing had stopped and her eyes were fixed on Bhagavan. After some time, Bhagavan changed his position and asked gently, 'Lakshmi, how do you feel now?' Lakshmi moved backward, as if reluctant to turn her tail towards Bhagavan, walked around the hall and went out." A very similar story was recorded by Sadhu Nathananda, seen here on the bottom right. Bhagavan and Lakshmi are above him. Note the huge grin on Bhagavan's face. Bhagavan often had a big smile on his face when he was with Lakshmi. I think he was responding to the huge love that Lakshmi felt towards him. Sadhu Nathananda wrote, Bhagavan, ever shedding grace by remaining in the meditative state of self-abidance, once externalized his attention, turned towards his devotees with a smile, and suddenly asked the following question. Do you know what state Lakshmi is in now? Having never witnessed such a scene before, the devotees were puzzled by this unusual question. There was a cow standing in front of him with a motionless and fixed expression on her face. Nathananda, seen in a different photo at the bottom, continued. The ever cheerful Bhagavan said, to the astonishment of the devotees, she is in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, revealing by this brief comment the extraordinary power of his grace. The cow, affectionately called Lakshmi, was closely associated with the ashram. When she came, as usual, for Bhagavan's darshan and stood in his presence, Bhagavan looked at her with great affection and started stroking her head. As a consequence of receiving this Hasta Diksha, initiation in which the Guru places his hands on the disciple's head, she experienced immediately the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. I will now move on to the day in 1948 when Lakshmi passed away. The narrator here is Surinagama, seen below the photo of Bhagavan and Lakshmi. In the first segment, she describes how Bhagavan put his hand on her heart center on her final day. When Bhagavan came to the cowshed at 9:45 as usual, he came to Lakshmi. Bhagavan sat on the hay by her side, lifted her head with both his hands, and passed one of his hands lightly over her face and throat. Then, placing his left hand on the head, he began pressing with the right hand fingers her throat right down to the heart. Since the action in the story takes place in the Ramanaswaram cowshed, here is a photo of it on the day it was inaugurated in the early 1930s. Bhagavan is seated in the center, while Lakshmi is the cow on the far left. After pressing like that for about a quarter of an hour, he said, addressing Lakshmi, "What do you say, mother? Do you want me to stay here alone? I could stay, but what to do? All the people will be around you, as in the case of my mother. Even so, why? Shall I go?" Lakshmi remained calm, devoid of all the bonds of this world and of the pains of her body, as though she were in samadhi. Bhagavan sat there, unwilling to move, and with a heart full of compassion. I was overwhelmed at the sight and exclaimed involuntarily, "Oh, Mother Aragama had the greatest luck, so has Lakshmi now." Having liberated Lakshmi with his touch, Bhagavan, perhaps surprisingly, decided to return to the hall while she was still alive. He must have been very confident that her eye thought had been definitively extinguished. G.V. Subramaya, seen here in the center, recorded his final remarks to her. Bhagavan addressed her in the tenderest voice, saying, "Amma, mother, what do you want? I must now go to the hall, as the people there will be asking for me. But wherever I may be, I will never leave you. I will always be with you. You are all right." The top photo here is of Lakshmi's Samadhi inside Ramanaswaram in the row of animal samadhis that includes valleys. The bottom photo is Surinagama in old age. The quote on this slide is what she recorded Bhagavan saying in the hall after Lakshmi had passed away. In the case of Lakshmi the cow, Bhagavan often told us that all the past incidents in life welled up in the same manner as in the case of the mother, but they subsided ultimately, which did not happen in the case of Palaniswami. When I pointed out that Bhagavan was not with Lakshmi till she breathed her last, as in the case of the mother, he said, "Oh, what desires did Lakshmi have after all? Only if there are desires in plenty will they remain till the end." I think this is a quite significant comment by Bhagavan. With Palaniswami and his mother, he was doing battle with their vasanas right till the end. With Lakshmi, he could see that her vasanas had gone and that her eye sense was not going to rise again. That was why he was confident enough to leave her while she was still alive. He knew that she had realized herself, and he knew that there was no possibility of a relapse. Surinagama, in her account, interpreted Bhagavan's comment, "What desires did Lakshmi have after all?" to mean that cows don't have vasanas. I take a slightly different view. I think that Lakshmi did have vasanas when she was young, but they were eradicated through her lifelong devotion to Bhagavan. On her final day, they had already been definitively extinguished before Bhagavan left her still alive and walked back to the hall to see the people who were waiting there for him. I spent a bit longer on retelling all these stories than I originally planned, but I think it was worth it because I want to bring together some of the themes and speculate a little bit on their implications. The one thing that all these hands-on, heart-touching and transmission stories have in common is that Bhagavan only used this method on devotees who were dying. There is no record of him trying it on devotees who were fit and healthy. Is there a reason for this? I think there is. It seems to be a method that focuses a huge amount of spiritual energy on the devotee's vasanas and eye thought. In the comments Bhagavan made on the walk to the lake, the story I retold at the beginning of this talk, Bhagavan made it clear that a huge flow of spiritual power could result in a devotee's physical death but not the death of the vasanas that would subsequently cause a rebirth. If a devotee is on the point of dying and is going to be dead of natural causes within 15 minutes or so, having physical death as a possible side effect of the transmission is no longer a major reason for holding back. The guru may as well use the full force of the self and see what happens. Liberation may not occur, but a parting blessing of a huge transmission of power may destroy a huge number of the remaining vasanas and ensure a future birth in which they are no longer a problem. This may have been what happened with the lesser-known cases of Valli the deer and Sathya Narayana Rao, but I should stress that there is no corroboration of this theory from anything Bhagavan ever said. It's just my own theory. What intrigues me more is Bhagavan's comments made on multiple occasions that he tried to liberate Swamy, seen above with Aragamo, Bhagavan's mother, and failed because he took his hands away too soon. Bhagavan said that he learned from this incident and kept his hands on his mother's heart center even after he thought that Aragamo was liberated. This might imply that a guru learns by trial and error how best to use the power of the self. The power may be there, but the effective utilization of it is learned rather than innate. I had a discussion with Papaji about this in Lucknow in the 1990s. Here are a couple of photos of us taken in that era. The top one was taken during a walk in the Lucknow Zoo, and the bottom one was taken on a bridge over the Ganga in Haridwar. This was my question. Doesn't the story of Bhagavan's attempt to liberate Swamy and his mother and Bhagavan's own comments on them indicate that Bhagavan learned how to use this hands-on heart center technique effectively by trial and error? Didn't his inexperience cause him to make a mistake with Swamy, and didn't his failure in this particular case give him the experience to enlighten his mother a few years later? This is a photo of Papaji taken in the late 1940s, shortly after he met Bhagavan for the last time. And this is his response, which I will spread over 2 slides. I don't think that there was a misjudgment or a mistake in this case. It was not the fault of the Maharshi that Swamy failed to realize the self in his dying moments. I would say instead that the Jivatman, individual self of Swamy, would not admit any interference from the Maharshi because it was not yet ready for enlightenment. For freedom, one needs the grace of the Paramatman, Supreme Self. This is a photo of Papaji standing in front of Bhagavan's Samadhi, taken around 1980, and below it is a photo of him sitting on the stairs at the back of the ashram. It was taken on the same trip. I haven't located any other photos of Papaji at Ramanashram. Papaji concluded, and if the Jivatman is not worthy, the Paramatman will not bestow that grace. Swamy had, by faithfully serving a Satguru, earned enough merit to go to some heavenly world, but he had not earned the ultimate liberating grace of the Paramatman. That is why the Maharshi could not succeed with him. On a superficial level, it may look as if a mistake was made, but the Paramatman never makes mistakes. If the worthiness was there, freedom automatically comes. If it is not there, no amount of interference by a guru can bring it about. I love Papaji's perspective on this, his immense reverence and ekabhakti, one-pointed devotion to his guru, made it impossible for him to consider the possibility that Bhagavan had made a mistake with Swamy, even though Bhagavan himself said on several occasions that a lack of prior experience in that case caused him to remove his hands too soon. I also like his conclusion that because there are no mistakes or failures in Paramatman, the ultimate cause of Swamy's failure to realize in his final moments was his immaturity. The dialogue that these answers are taken from started off with me mentioning that Bhagavan had appeared to learn from his experiences with Swamy when he later liberated his mother. That led me to play devil's advocate and ask him the following question, which I knew in advance he would disagree with. My question was, It seems to me that one learns how to be a guru by trial and error. That is to say, enlightenment may be there, the power to wake others up may be there, but the effective use of this power requires some practice and experience. Do you agree? This is me sitting with Papaji in his living room around 1994. Papaji, of course, disagreed and gave me the following uncompromising reply. No, I don't. A guru does not need to practice. Gurus are born with the ability to teach. If you are destined to be a guru, the self automatically bestows on you all the necessary knowledge and power. It doesn't send you to school to learn these things. It gives them to you directly. And this leads me on to a story that was narrated by N.R. Krishnamurti Iyer, a devotee of Bhagavan who lived in Madurai and collected stories from Bhagavan's childhood from people who had known him then. This is Krishnamurti Iyer holding his daughter in his arms in a group photo that was taken in the late 1930s at Ramanaswaram. This remarkable story, which backs up what Papaji asserted in the previous reply, was told to Krishnamurti Iyer by Narayana Swamy, a local librarian who had visited Bhagavan's house in the 1890s. From the context, I would guess that it took place in the 6 weeks between Bhagavan's self-realization and his departure for Arunachala. And this is the story. Narayana Swamy saw his friend sitting for long stretches of time in a small room on the first floor. Narayana Swamy, thinking that it was some kind of meditation, asked Bhagavan if he could also learn how to sit like this. Bhagavan told him to sit cross-legged on the floor. As he was sitting there, Bhagavan pressed the point of a pencil midway between his eyebrows. On the right, there is a picture of Krishnamurti Iyer as an old man in the 1980s, and next to it is a crop from the earlier photo showing him and his daughter in the late 1930s. His story concluded. Soon afterwards, Narayana Swamy lost all awareness of his body and the world and entered a trance that lasted for about half an hour. When he came back to his normal state, the first thing he saw was Bhagavan's face wreathed with smiles. Narayana Swamy tried several times to repeat this experience by himself, but he was never able to duplicate it. This is the only photo Ramanaswaram has of a devotee called Narayana Swamy. He is seen here sitting with Chinnaswamy. This may well be the Narayana Swamy who passed on the story about Bhagavan putting him into a kind of samadhi with the end of a pencil. He looks to be about the same age as Chinnaswamy, which is consistent with the events that are being narrated by him. The extraordinary thing about this story is the probable date it took place. In 1896, after Bhagavan's realization and before he left home to go to Arunachala. Where did Bhagavan learn to do this? How did he know that there was a point between the eyebrows that could serve as a focal point for a transmission of power? The answer that Papaji gave earlier, which I'll repeat again here, seems to be the likeliest one. Papaji, a guru does not need to practice. Gurus are born with the ability to teach. If you are destined to be a guru, the self automatically bestows on you all the necessary knowledge and power. It doesn't send you to school to learn these things. It gives them to you directly. I want to raise another point that is relevant to this discussion about devotees who realize the self after being touched in their final moments by Bhagavan. Bhagavan always insisted that his silent presence and silent teachings were the most powerful, but the two devotees whom he publicly certified as being fully realized, his mother Argamo and Lakshmi the cow, both attained this state after being touched by Bhagavan in their final moments. On the right are two of the few good photos we have of Bhagavan's mother. Liberation through the touch of the Guru is not something that Bhagavan spoke about much, but it did produce the results in these two cases. The powerful touch of the Guru can be decisive when a devotee's ego and vasanas are engaged in a life or death struggle with the power of the self that is trying to make them go back to the heart and be extinguished there. To illustrate this, I want to include a story from the lives of Lakshmana Swamy and Saradamma. Lakshmana Swamy realized the self in 1949 in the presence of Bhagavan. The photos on the right were taken in the early 1950s after he had returned to his hometown in what is now Andhra Pradesh. In 1978, his devotee, Saradamma, realized the self in his presence. On the day of her realization, her I thought had repeatedly plunged into the heart and given her brief experiences of the self, but it had not died there. This is one statement she made before her eye was completely annihilated. It was recorded on a tape recorder that Lakshmana Swamy had turned on because he knew her realization was near. So what Saradamma said, I am everywhere. I am not the body, I have no body, so I have no fear. I am immobile. Whatever I may do, I am immobile. I am shining as the self. Everything is a great void, Mahashunya. How can I describe the self in words? It is neither light nor dark. No one can describe what it is. In the past, present, and future, no one can describe what it is. It is difficult to describe. Self is self. That is all. Lakshmana Swamy played this tape for me as we were discussing the events of that day. And I should point out that these sentences were separated by long periods of silence. There would be a sentence, there would be a pause, another sentence, a long pause, and so on. It seems that she was struggling for words, struggling to express the inexpressible. And in the end, all she could say is self, that is all. The accompanying photo of her was taken a few weeks later. Lakshmana Swamy could see that the experience was a temporary one because her I thought had not died. He played back her words to me and then made the following comments. Anyone whose mind completely subsides into the heart for a short time can talk like an enlightened person. Their experience of the self is the same as that of a realized person. However, their I thought is not dead, and it is likely to re-emerge at any time. Such an experience is not the final state because it is not permanent. This photo of him was taken in 1974, 4 years before the events in this story took place. And this is how I recorded the final climactic moments in No Mind, I Am the Self, the book I wrote about their lives and teachings. I have spread it over 2 slides. Throughout that day, Sarada's mind kept sinking into the self, but on each occasion it came out again. At 4 p.m., the I thought went from the heart to the brain and started to bang against the inside of her skull. Sarada said later that it was like an axe trying to split her head open from the inside. Since she was not able to bear the pain, she came forward, took Swami's hand and placed it on her head. These photos both date from around the time that this story took place. And this is how I concluded the narrative of her realization. The I thought went back to the heart, but again it was only a temporary subsidence. 3 minutes later, it rose again and once again started to bang against the inside of her skull. Saradamma came forward, placed her head on Swami's feet, and a few seconds later, the I thought returned to its source and died forever. This seems to have been a surprisingly violent process. There was acute pain as something inside Saradamma's skull was banging and trying to escape. Lakshmana Swamy told me when I was interviewing him about this that if he had not been there to effect the definitive subsidence and extinction of her I thought, it would somehow have escaped through her skull and headed off for another birth. These are the occasions when the power of the jnani is needed to kill the ego. The guru can see that the I is not dead, even though it is experiencing the self and talking as if it is enlightened. In these circumstances, the guru can then use the power of the self to subdue and permanently eradicate the I thought. That's me, incidentally, at the bottom, sitting with Saradamma in the early 1980s. This episode with Saradamma and Lakshmana Swamy has some similarities to the account I gave earlier, in which Munagala Venkatramaya recorded Bhagavan struggling with the I thought and the samskaras of his dying mother. I will repeat the relevant phrases here. Munagala. He, Bhagavan, said later that there was a struggle between himself and his mother until her spirit reached the heart. Evidently, the soul passes through a series of subtle experiences, and through Bhagavan's touch generates a current which turns the soul back from its wandering into the heart. The samskaras, however, persist, and a struggle is kept up between the spiritual force set up by his touch and the innate samskaras until the latter are entirely destroyed. It would seem that there is often a major battle between the dying ego and the power of the self as it tries to make it go back to its source and die there. The top photo from the 1930s shows Munagala circled in red with Bhagavan in a group photo at Ramanashramam. For the final segment of this talk, I want to raise and then give potential answers to a question that has always intrigued me. Why do some jnanis have the power to liberate others while others don't? Some realize the self but don't have either the destiny to be a teacher or have the liberating power to reveal that state to others. Or they simply have no inclination to teach since they are satisfied with the knowledge of the self that has been revealed. Muruggana, for example, wrote thousands of verses expressing his gratitude to Bhagavan for having granted him liberation, but he always declined to be a guru and told people who wanted to be his own devotees to follow Bhagavan instead. Lakshmana Swamy and Papaji, featured at the bottom of the slide, both realized the self through Bhagavan's power and grace, and later in life both had the power to reveal that state to people who came into contact with them. Muruggana, circled in red in the top photo, didn't have that destiny. Where did that power come from? First of all, I will say that I know of no statement by Bhagavan that would shed light on this question. However, the two teachers at the bottom both gave me answers to this question. I gave an answer from Papaji, seen here outside his old family home in downtown Lucknow in 1992, earlier in the talk. For him, it was simply a matter of destiny. If the self has decided that it wants you to be a realized teacher, it gives you all the necessary power to do the job. You don't earn that power by undergoing long periods of tapas or meditation. It's not a result of anything you have done or practiced in the past. And having that power doesn't indicate that you are more enlightened than those who don't. If you don't have it, it simply means that it is not your destiny to be a guru. I told a story earlier in this talk about Bhagavan using the power of the self on one of his childhood friends, Narayana Swamy, when he was only 16 years old. The power was there along with the knowledge of how to use it. Bhagavan never did anything to acquire that power or learn how to use it. Lakshmana Swamy, seen here on the top left, added an additional possibility when I spoke to him in the early 1980s. He said that if, after realization, it is one's destiny to sit quietly for a few years, completely absorbed in the self within, then a power builds up which can be used to transmit the experience of the self to others. This happened to both Bhagavan and Lakshmana Swamy, with both undergoing a few years of what appeared to be near perpetual samadhi states after their realization. I don't think that these two explanations are necessarily contradictory or mutually exclusive. A guru's destiny may include a long post-enlightenment period of self-absorption. It's not something that the jnani decides to do. He doesn't choose to sit quietly and develop power. It's just something that happens, something that is a part of the physical script. However it may have arrived, Bhagavan's body was clearly and visibly charged up with the power of the self. It was so strong it manifested as a slight tremor in his head. This is a brief video clip of Bhagavan from the late 1940s, sitting in the new hall on the stone sofa. The tremor was not a result of advanced age, since devotees who met him in the 1920s have reported that he had it even then. But keep playing this. The power of the self coursing through his body also affected his balance. Kanji Swami has commented that his walking stick was not just to help with arthritic knees, it acted as a support to stop him from toppling over. When asked about it, the physical trembling in his head, keep playing this, Bhagavan said that the power of the self in the body was the equivalent of an elephant entering a weak hut. The hut is going to shake and wobble a bit when seen from the outside. This tremor was there almost all the time. It disappeared when he withdrew into the self in what appeared to others to be samadhi states. And more interestingly, it stopped when he was transmitting the power of the self through his eyes to specific devotees. It seems to me that this was a bit like earthing a current. If there was a target, the power of the self ran out towards it, and the physical tremors stopped. For the final part of this talk on the power of the Guru, I want to return to Papaji because he had a very interesting explanation on the true source of the power, one that I had not heard or read anywhere else. Before I give his views on this, I want to give a preliminary quote from him about the nature of desire, since it is relevant to what follows. Like Ramana Maharshi, Papaji taught that vasanas, the hidden desires, create the objects that appear in front of us. The converse of this is that when desires are wholly absent, nothing is seen. The dichotomy of seer and seen vanishes. The quote will appear over 2 slides. Papaji. When there are desires, desires manifest and there is no liberation. Everything and everyone you see around you are manifestations of your desires. When you have no desires, you don't see anything at all. Try it now and see for yourself. Stop the mind and its desires and see if there is anything left to see. When there is a desire, the eyes start working and they start seeing things which become objects of desire. Papaji continues. The seer and the seen are maintained by the desire of one for the other. When the desires are not there, there is no seer and nothing to be seen. If there is no desire, you can't see, you can't hear, you can't smell, you can't taste. Try it just for a fraction of a second. Let your mind be absolutely absent for a second and see what happens to all the objects of desire that you used to think were real. And now here is the answer I promised you, in which Papaji explains what he feels is the true source of the power of the Guru. It was prompted by this question that I asked him. David. The Maharshi said once that the Guru never does anything in response to a devotee's request because he has no sankalpa, no ability to act with a particular goal in mind. But by abiding in this desireless state, the sanidhi, a presence is created that automatically takes care of all the devotee's needs and requests. I presume that you agree with this. Papaji responded with this reply that I will spread over the next 3 slides. The enlightened man, the jnani, does not do anything. He just sits quietly like a mountain. He does not respond to your requests by doing anything, but if you go near him with a desire in your mind, there will be an automatic response. If you throw a rubber ball at a wall, it will bounce back. The angle and speed of the ball off the wall will depend on the angle and speed at which you throw it. The wall does not have to decide how to respond to the incoming ball. When you go into the presence of a jnani with desires in your mind, the appropriate response comes back automatically. You don't even have to talk about them. If your mind is in the presence of a jnani, it will be flinging its desires at the wall of his enlightenment, and that wall will give you back what you desire or need. But if you go into the presence of a jnani without any thoughts or desires, what will be reflected back will be the state of thoughtlessness and desirelessness. In his presence, you will be established in that state. This is the sanidhi, the presence of the jnani at work. You don't need to ask for anything, just go near him. I like this answer. The power of the Guru works, according to Papaji, because the Guru himself has no agenda, no desire to use the power. Seeing nothing other than his own self and having no desires, he doesn't see anything that needs to be fixed, improved, or changed. I will conclude with some advice from Papaji on how to take full advantage of the Guru's desireless state. He said, when I was at Ramana Ashram in the 1940s, I used to spend hours looking at the Maharshi's eyes. They would be open and staring, but not focused on anything. Though his eyes were open, they were not seeing anything. Those eyes were completely free of thoughts and desires. The mind is revealed very clearly in the eyes, but in those eyes there was nothing at all to see. In all the hours I concentrated on his eyes, I didn't see even a flicker of thought or a desire. I have not seen utterly desireless eyes like his on another face. I have met many great saints in my life, but no one has impressed me as much as the Maharshi did. I had asked Papaji several times how the power of the Guru actually worked. He mentioned these multiple requests for information in his final answer. If you want freedom, find a man like this who has absolutely no desire, someone who sits unmoving like a mountain. Sit in his presence and see what happens. You want to know who or what is doing the work when someone gets enlightened in the Guru's presence. Nobody is doing the work. Enlightenment happens in these circumstances because the Guru is abiding in a state of absolute desirelessness. And with that interesting and illuminating answer, I will conclude my presentation on the power of the Guru and its practical applications. Thanks for listening.